including 50 lavender plants, which I just harvested. And also, let me agree to be recorded here. And also we've added 15 young hens, which just now started producing, and they are the cutest, littlest eggs you've ever seen. So that's kind of my life around here. I'm grateful to be with you all today. And the last time I was with the Diabetes Alliance team was in November, when I spoke primarily on insulin pump management and pump updates. And I was about 7 days into COVID at that time, and I have no clue what I said. So pardon me if you were on that call and I repeat myself, but our focus today is really continuous glucose monitoring. And if it wouldn't have thrown everybody for too much of a loop, I might have changed the title to Making Glucose Dysregulation More Meaningful rather than Diabetes Management, because that's really where we're headed with the use of glucose monitoring. So with that said, I'll go on. I think I'll go on to the next slide. There we go. Some disclaimers for you. I am a stockholder in AbbVie, which is the parent company of Abbott Diabetes Care, and my husband holds stock in Sanofi, used to be Aventis. We did meet in a professional manner at the launch of Lantus, just for something kind of fun for you there. I am a consultant with Abbott Diabetes Care at this time, and I train on all of the pumps. I'm certified as a trainer, so I guess that qualifies me as not being playing favorites. I am qualified too. Today, what I really want to talk to you about is the current continuous glucose monitors and how specifically they work, and sort of enlarge your horizons as needed, and be able to discuss and demonstrate examples of how and when to use CGM technology to improve time in range, which really is now the gold standard of how well we're doing managing glucose levels, reducing hyper and hypo, and identifying behaviors that are associated with diabetes self-management, or shall we just say glucose management again. And then I have some resources for you to take away in this slide deck too. These are the current continuous glucose monitoring systems: the Libre 14-day, the Libre 2, Libre Pro system, Dexcom G6, and the Medtronic Guardian. I did not list Eversense, which is the implantable, because I want to talk to these specifically as a type that are more readily available, shall we call it. I have a survey for you, and I think Ashley is going to help us with this. You can read the questions on the slide. And there's your survey. Question number 1, do you consider yourself an expert in the use of CGM teaching and training patients? And I'm really only asking you this question for my benefit and tailoring the next hour's worth of talk. So Ashley, let us know when we can move on to the next question.
Yes, I think the way I added it will end polling. It'll show you the responses, and then we'll move on to the next.
Okay. All right. That's really helpful to me. I want to give you what you need. And the other thing I'd mention at this point is, if I am not explaining something well, throw it into your chat box, and Ashley's going to watch that box for me. And maybe we can have some engaged questions along the way. Okay, question number 2. Do you consider yourself an expert at interpreting CGM downloads? I feel like the Jeopardy music should play.
I should have done that. Next time.
Great. Okay. On to the next question, which might be self-evident now. Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thanks, Ashley, for doing that. Okay, so on to the next slide, I believe. Let's see. There, whoops. Got that direction. All right, Ashley, so my buttons aren't working. Does that mean you have control? There we go. Okay. All right, just a little bit about each one of these systems. The Dexcom G6 has a 2-hour warm-up. That means after you place it, you won't see data for 2 hours. It is factory calibrated, meaning that unless it's requested by an integrated device such as a tandem pump, you don't have to calibrate it, but there are times when it might be suggested by Dexcom customer care that you do calibrate it. The word calibrate means that you're going to do your very best finger stick and enter that result into a menu within the Dexcom G6 handheld reader and or your phone if you're using that. It does have replacement claim for blood glucose monitoring, but there are times when CGM and BG can be different, and you might want to take a look at an old-fashioned blood glucose check. It is a 10-day wear with alarms, and there are mobile apps and sharing capacity. The Freestyle Libre has a 1-hour warm-up. It is factory calibrated as well. There is no means to enter a calibration, and it is replacement to blood glucose or finger checks. Now, there are 2 particular systems available. The Libre 14-day, and it has no alarms, and this system can be used with a phone-compatible app. That was the first system that was approved by the FDA for use in this country. Libre 2 is also a 14-day sensor. It has alarms and is expected, and I'll just say, insert a little asterisk there, expected to have mobile apps and sharing compatibility. Medtronic Guardian has a 2-hour warm-up, must be calibrated, and the system calls for it at particular times. It does not replace blood glucose. It is a 7-day wear, and it does have alarms. It does have mobile apps and sharing, and I'll show you more about all of these in some slides coming up. But first, I want to talk about some premises that are really key to understanding with the use of continuous glucose monitoring. Without belaboring the point, I just want to say one of the most important things to understand is that CGM systems, sensors, measure interstitial fluid glucose, not blood glucose. So it's measuring in a different spot. And here you can see a cartoon drawing as to where that is under the skin, okay? And this becomes really important. So there are times when we should expect these 2 things to be different from one another, okay? And they're highlighted rather sloppily in green by me there, that if your glucose is changing rapidly, you're likely going to see a larger difference. If you have really poor finger stick habits, like you lick your finger and then you do your test, it's possible that you are going to insert some variance yourself there. So teaching your patients that absolutely your finger stick must be perfect also. The other thing is that there may be interference by other substances that you're consuming or taking. The known one is vitamin C with the Libre system, but you have to take a lot of vitamin C. Your glucose strips were expired or contaminated. The comparisons that you're making are done at different times. 15-minute intervals can be a big time span. And no, if your glucose is changing rapidly, your CGM and your blood glucose will not be the same. Okay, so it can just be expected. Likewise, if your sensor has come off, and is just hanging there by the adhesive, but it's no longer under your skin, you're not going to get an accurate reading. Now, here is, I bequeath this to you as a semi-retired diabetes educator. Some of you might have seen this. This is a picture that I draw faithfully to explain what diabetes is, or I should say maybe what happens when we consume food, where does it go, what does it do, how does it get where it's supposed to get, and then also to explain a couple of things about measuring glucose. And so I talk about the fact that food is on a journey. It starts in our mouth, it goes down to the gut. Some of it is, it's all converted to glucose. Some of it is saved in the liver or stored there for times in between meals. Thank goodness we're not like my horses. They have to graze all night long. We get to go to sleep, and that's the liver's role. But glucose moves into the bloodstream where it's supposed to be joined by just the right amount of insulin. So you can tailor that part of your discussion depending on whether you're talking about someone with prediabetes or someone with type 1 diabetes. And then the insulin drags the glucose through the interstitial fluid, hence where CGM sensors live and can capture that glucose and measure it. And then you can see by the little hand drawing that that's how I illustrate. That's where my finger poke gathers glucose information. Now in the boxes, I've tailored this particular drawing specifically to talk about continuous glucose monitoring and food. So food profiles are different than insulin profiles. And so food, and those of you who are registered dietitians, I'm preaching to the choir here. Food as glucose enters the bloodstream at different rates based on the composition of the food. And so that's another thing when you're teaching or explaining what people are seeing on their continuous glucose monitor, you can spend a lot of time talking about food. And if they're wearing a continuous monitor, they'll have that revealed to them and actually see, oh, this food looks like this. And maybe the refined carbohydrates look like the, I don't know if you can see my pointer arrow here, look like this bottom high spiky drawing, whereas the one above might be kind of an average mixed meal with carbohydrates, and maybe even a few refined, but some fat and some protein. Or the top one that's a lot longer and smoother might be steel cut oats with some Greek yogurt or something along those lines. The next thing I want to make sure that I'm explaining to people is continuous glucose monitoring arrows, trend arrows, what they mean. And in the very bottom of that little drawing, you can see, if you really stare at it hard, it looks like a 3-car train. And that's another way to help people understand what I might see. My blood glucose might be the engine. My continuous glucose monitor sensor reading might be the caboose. So as the glucose is moving up, and you see my finger is going up, my finger stick might be higher. As the glucose is going down or up and around that peak there and back down, my glucose is headed down, and my finger stick might be lower than my caboose or my continuous monitor result. Okay, so that's a little insight on how I talk to people. Now we're going to dive into some more specifics. It's really important to understand how insulin works. And I'm talking about prescribed insulin in the bottle at this point in time. And so generally speaking, we can talk about duration of insulin action as having a duration of 3 to 5 hours. In younger or more sensitive people, you might see a longer duration of action that's noticeable. In people with type 2 diabetes, you might not see much insulin action from the 4th to the 5th hour. Maybe if they're fasting, there's a steady, slow decline of a few points over that 4th to 5th hour. And so when you look at trend arrows, and this is just a little cartoon drawing, but depending on when insulin is given and the food has been eaten, with the idea that to use our prescribed insulin or insulin in a bottle to look most like what the insulin being secreted by our beta cells looks like in first and second phase secretion during meal or glucose arriving, we really have learned that we want to eat or we want to dose our insulin 15 to 20 minutes before eating. Now, this can be varied a little bit with things that we know that even an integrated pump doesn't know, like I'm going to be exercising after I eat this meal, or I've already exercised. So you fine tune the timing of which when you give the insulin a little bit based on the things you know. But generally speaking, we can call the onset 15 minutes and the peak 1 to 2 hours. So if we hit the timing and at least get that insulin going ahead of the food entry, we will see a better overall time in range. Okay, so, but the first place is to understand duration of insulin action and the difference that you might experience. Okay, now this is an interesting slide, and I hope you find some of these next slides kind of fun. This is a rate of change in someone without diabetes and has the big toes in pre-diabetes. And so this is what the beta cells do. So you can see at 7:46 p.m., something was eaten there. And so then the glucose started rising. This person does not take any insulin, with a straight up arrow, which indicates a movement. Oops.
Guido Reiteration Company.
Sorry about that, you guys. Let me turn that off. So a rate of change of pretty quick. A straight up arrow usually means somewhere around 20 to 30 milligrams per deciliter per 10 minutes. And you can kind of see that. So one of the things that, diabetes educators do who like CGM and insulin is sometimes they count out exactly, what am I moving at, divide it by minutes and figure out exact rate of change. Okay, you can see then how quickly 10 minutes later, those beta cells have risen to the occasion, although there might be lag, because the up arrow, the arrow itself, will take about 10 to 15 minutes worth of continuous data before it turns around and changes. So my guess is at 8:41, had I done a finger stick, okay, we would have seen a lower glucose, but I wouldn't have had a trend arrow out of my finger stick. So it takes a while for that trend arrow to get, no matter what the device is, to get consistent enough data to turn it around and change it. Okay, so I think this is kind of a fun one to see. What can the beta cells be capable of? Okay, here's a cartoon of what you can expect. Okay, so when the arrows are flat in any system, it means that glucose is relatively stable. It doesn't mean it's not moving. And this is really critical in someone who's maybe fasting or preparing to exercise. And sometimes on the front of your systems, and you look at so on the front of a system, and I'll show you a picture in a minute that'll help us see it better, but there are dots also. You realize you have a glucose value, you have a trend arrow, and you have dots. The dots, when I calculate them out, they change at about every 6 minutes. And so you want to teach people to also look at dots to understand what change they might be seeing. Okay, sometimes you can see the dots rise or fall, but the arrow remains the same. And in a situation where the arrow is flat, this becomes more important. You might see dots slowly leading you down to a lower glucose than you desire. And then remember that that's your continuous monitor. So your actual finger stick might even be 10 to 20 points lower. Okay, because a flat arrow generally means that you're moving at 0 to 10 milligrams per deciliter, but it could be moving a little bit faster than that. The oblique arrows or slanted arrows generally mean that you're moving at 10 to 20 milligrams per deciliter in 10 minutes. And the straight up, whether they're doubles on the Dexcom or straight down, doubles on the Dexcom, single straight up, single straight down on the Libre, usually mean an average of movement of about 30 milligrams per deciliter in 10 minutes. Now, you might say, okay, that's a lot of detail, and why shouldn't we just look at the arrows and go, oh, I'm falling, I better have some glucose. So how I teach arrows to people is I talk about, well, if you're at the peak and your insulin hasn't shown up quite yet, and your glucose is, 210, those straight down arrows might be what we would expect to see because the insulin's kicking in, whether it's your endogenous insulin or your exogenous insulin, either one. It also might help to understand if you have, a glucose level that's 120 and you have an oblique arrow, meaning that you're moving down, but maybe in the past, if someone did a finger stick and they were 120, they'd never think of maybe eating some carbohydrates to sort of balance things out. But if you are falling and you see that because of your trend arrow or the dots on the front of your hour graph, then you may decide, oh, I think I'll have a little bite of something right now and sort of hedge my bets there, especially if you're about to play tennis or go swimming or something along those lines. So understanding those trend arrows and how they can modify decision making is really critical. And I see the biggest decision points now for people are how much and when to treat low glucose. And so, the whole name of the game these days is spending more time in range or in your target area and less time out of range. And if you overtreat lows, you're going to spend more time out of range. So using trend arrows to help you understand how much do I need and when do I need it, depending on what I'm going to do. So again, the things that the systems don't know about you, what you're going to do, can become really helpful and critical to change an overall picture and the time and range that you see. So, but the biggest key to this is understanding insulin and trend arrows and what those two things mean. All right, let's take a look at the systems themselves. So here on the front of this Dexcom G6 parts slide, it shows you all the parts of the Dexcom G6. You can see on the little handheld reader or the phone app, you can see now the dots that I'm talking about. You can change the length of that graph in the menu, but the dot graph generally defaults to 3 hours on any system. And I think that's helpful to look at because it sort of encapsulates the duration of insulin action, or you can certainly see, even if someone's not using insulin or any diabetes management even, that I ate at this point and this is what happened following it. Okay. So here with the Dexcom, of course, you do have the option of using your phone as a receiver and or using the handheld receiver. Because it's integrated with the Tandem pump. The Tandem pump replaces the little handheld receiver when someone starts using the Tandem pump. The application is with the somewhat large device there with the orange thing there. That orange is a press button. You take off the little protector there that keeps you from firing the sensor into the air before you're ready and have it against your skin. The little gray part there is the transmitter. Sensors, again, are good for every 10 days, and the transmitter is good for every 3 months. You have to get a new transmitter with this current system. The Dexcom Clarity reports. Let's spend a few minutes talking about reports, given that some of you were kind of like a little bit waffly about how comfortable you feel with this. Here's the best news is, and I'll give you some resources at the very end that talk about looking at the new measurement time in range or target ranges. Sometimes you hear that ascribed to what we're calling how we look at things. So this particular slide here shows the Dexcom view of kind of their overall report. The whole idea many years ago when I was working at Abbott, and really all three companies that were involved in sensor development really got to talking and recognized that the International Diabetes Center, so Richard Bergenstahl and Roger Mazzi's development of what's called the AGP or ambulatory glucose profiling was really, the best thing in looking at glucose since sliced bread. but getting it out and getting it adopted by all of the players took some time. And I would like to say that it's really been in the last 5 years that this has come to fruition. And it's wonderful because it, number one, it teaches you how to look for variability. So if you look in the upper picture on the upper right, you can see there's a lot of variability through the night here for some reason. Maybe this is a teenager who stays up late and sometimes eats and sometimes gets fearful of lows, although this is the 200 line. There is not a whole lot of thread low here, but that's a perceived thing. There's a lot of variability in the afternoon about 3 p.m. here too, which also makes me think maybe teenager or college kid having some snacks after school and then hitting it with a bunch of insulin before mom and dad ask what the glucose is before dinner, and so now I'm back in range, do pretty well through the dinner hour, all things considered, but lots of time spent, because this is your average line, lots of time spent higher than desired. So when you look at this on the AGP, it compresses things. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Here's another one with a lot of variability, okay? The thing about this report that I like, and Libre's is the same way, is that you can print off one report, which gives you a wonderful summary. And it also shows you the last several days independently. So if someone says to you, oh, when I had that low, blah, 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 you can actually go look at that low, okay, and maybe talk more about it. Other things on the report are standard deviation, which is what measures the glucose variability. And glucose variability, just so you know, when you see lots of these ups and downs right here, like this one, it has to do with patient decision making usually, or behaviors. I am sometimes hesitant to say this has to do with your behavior because that sounds pretty punitive, really. But you can say things like, so this looks like we make different decisions day to day. So then you can, maybe tear that apart. And if I rarely look at data further back than 5 or 6 days, because nobody remembers anything, number one. But if you can kind of tease apart, you might find that on a certain day, we have, a sports activity and we don't want to go low. I met recently with a delightful young man who's just been hired as a police officer, and he doesn't want to go low in the line of duty. And so there are lots of reasons that are, choices that people make that may raise the glucose in places. If they understand more about what they're doing and how to fine tune it, maybe they won't go as high in boosting glucose up when they're fearful of a low. And so starting to tease these reports apart can be really helpful. Let's take a look at Libre and some more reports. So here you have both of those products shown. The blue is the Libre 2, and the black is the 14-day system. And that's why you can see the phone over here, okay? You can still access both. So if you have people who are not using insulin or diabetes medication that might lead to low glucose, and there's not a need for alarms per se, maybe using the 14-day system is okay. This is the one with alarms, but you do carry the reader. I will tell you, I have used both. And when I carried the Libre 2 with just the reader, that little reader stayed in my pocket. I had no problem keeping a hold of it. The other thing is it's easy to get an extra reader. Most physicians have samples now of both Dexcoms and Libres. And so samples are available. If somebody loses a reader, it's pretty easy to get one from their physician. So on the screens, and this is true of both Dexcom and Libre, you have lots of data right there at your fingertip. The little reader shows it too. I'm very fond of looking what my average glucose is. And also you have customizable goals for someone who might be pre-diabetes. You might tighten up those goals. So this little blue threshold line around here is pretty tight. It doesn't have to be 80 and 180. It has nothing to do with their treatment. It's just an eyeball trigger. I'm in the blue zone. I'm in the blue zone. And when did I move out of that? Okay. So those are ways to use screens as well. And like I said, both of them have it. The application device for the Libre is fairly straightforward and simple, as the Dexcom G6 is now too. They're easy to apply. I'm not sure that Dexcom has a recycling program, but Abbott has started a recycling program for both the sensor and as well the installation device, if you will. So you can request that from Abbott from their website. And then lots of people are interested in that. I think they sort of followed suit from Omnipod. Okay. So the Libre report you can see looks very similar to the report that I showed you from Dexcom, and kudos to the companies for adopting. The idea is like, when you wear a Holter heart monitor, you don't have to look at 6 different companies' way of reporting out what those readings show someone. So let's mimic that when we, as a collaborative effort amongst all companies producing CGM, let's make our reports look similar and give the same kind of information. So you can see on this one that there are statistics, tells you how much time was active with the CGM. And it also tells you here time in ranges with I like it, kind of the red light, green light system. So it draws people's eyes to it. As we talk in a few more minutes about use of the data when you're talking to people, this is one of my favorite types of reports to show someone as how much time as compared. So if you take snips with your computer, color snips, and put that into your electronic medical records, you can call up the last time we visited and now this time we visited, and just look at the color bar of your time in range. And that can be really a wow factor for you. This right here, just so you know what it means, glucose management indicator, that's essentially saying supposed A1C could be, okay? Glucose variability, again, that is your highs and lows, okay? The larger that number gets, the worse things are. And we need to focus on some behaviors. So if this number starts crawling up, we need to start asking questions. Well, what do you tell me about your evening? Do you eat meals or do you nibble all the time? And so lots of those sort of probing but fun questions. Tell me about yourself. What's life like for you? And just see what comes out. Okay, so Medtronic Guardian system. So this is the Sugar IQ app that they use, pulls out a lot of, you might think about this or you might look at that kind of thing. And so the system is still relatively the same. If you've been exposed to the Medtronic sensing technology, you have your little sensor and your transmitter that snaps into the sensor, fondly called the clam or clamshell sometimes. It does have a rechargeable battery. So the transmitter is used for up to a year with that warranty. Your sensor is a 7-day. There's automatic uploads with the CareLink system. And so there are 2 apps that you can use, one for uploading and one for sharing sensor data with your loved ones and that sort of thing. On your phone, the face is relatively the same as the other systems that I've shown you. As far as what you can see in the phone app, as far as how it pulls data apart, there's lots of color in the Sugar IQ Diabetes Assistant app feature. And I am a color person. I like red light, green light stuff. Okay. So you might find that. And here's the kind of thing where it really points out to both the user and maybe the professional, kind of the area that might need to be focused on. And again, they've got lots of color in the Sugar IQ insight reports. And that's the IBM Watson technology. For any of you who are curious about that, you can certainly go to the Medtronic website and look more. It's pretty impressive there. And this is an AGP type report. Okay, so it's got compression, but it shows consistency too. And so this is where you would want to say, oh, what are you doing here? Oh, you're taking extra insulin when you see that high. So if you have someone who, oh, you bolus after you eat, that could be the problem. Because if you bolus after you eat, what usually happens is people stay higher later longer, and physicians and PAs and well-meaning prescribers maybe don't get the opportunity to probe that as well as they should. And so they change the carb ratio. Instead of using 1 to 12, you're now using 1 to 9 because you're trying to figure out, why am I so high after eating? When essentially it's, oh, maybe I should take my insulin before I eat. And the insulin works more efficiently and you need less of it. So lots of things in continuous glucose monitoring reports and screens to set the stage for good conversations. Okay, so why should we use CGM? I've given you some ideas. For the most part, there's no finger pokes or very few finger pokes. Lots of time people, when they initially start CGM, they don't trust it. They've heard things, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, about what have you heard about CGM, or what was your prior experience? Because maybe they tried it 5 years ago, and CGM's come a long way, baby. It may cost less than doing finger pokes, okay, even out of pocket. But the big thing here is you see more, you learn more, and you're more likely to change more. And there are a lot of studies that validate this. And one study, one of my favorite studies back in the old days, when I worked at Abbott, and for those of you who've been around since before DIRT, Abbott had a continuous glucose monitor called Navigator, which was out on the US market for about a year or so. And there was a study that we did, and I was part of the clinical study team for that study, where essentially we just sort of threw the device at the people. Here's the device, here's the sensor, here's how you put it on, and gave virtually no explanation or training. Okay, but seeing is believing, and people, you can still look up this study, and I can't quote it anymore. I used to be able to quote it quite well, but people changed. People's A1Cs dropped. People had fewer hypoglycemic events because they could see. And so, mostly we're smart people. People are smart. They go, oh, if I do this, this is my result. So maybe I'll do something different next time, slightly different, and so it was really amazing. It was called the Navigator Home Use Study. How will people do with this thing if they get no training? And I think that gave a lot of people in all companies courage to go forward. Well, now there is a plethora of studies showing that wearing a CGM improves outcomes for people with diabetes across the board in all components. Less hypo, lower A1C without more hypoglycemia, less money spent in healthcare resources, and more time in range, which we would, I think, all agree that reduces the likelihood of developing complications. And of course, we'll have 20-year studies and 30-year studies coming out of Europe in no time at all. And there are some that talk about especially the reduced cost in healthcare. Okay, here is one study. This is from a poster at the last American Diabetes Association meeting, just to provide you with a study about A1C data. And this is from Libre, because it was a poster that's one of the things that was most current. Okay, I believe in some extrapolation to CGM in general. So where you have greater A1Cs, you're going to see greater change. Now, my premise probably is if I have someone who has an A1C above 12, hopefully someone's prescribing some medication, in the beginning. Let's say this is someone with type 2 diabetes who waltzes in with an above 12 A1C. Technically, they should be starting insulin, at least until we get glucose in a better place and can work on lifestyle changes and all those kinds of things. So you do see a greater change in A1C, of course. But the average, for everybody with a mean A1C of 10.16, the next A1C was 8.78. That's pretty impressive. Okay, it doesn't take into consideration in that line item, but down here you can see baseline medication usage. This is a poster that had not yet been printed when I or published in a journal article when I took it from the posters. So, but you can see insulin as compared to non-insulin use, and that's still an impressive decrease. All right, so when should we use CGM? Now, not very many years ago, CGM was kind of an elitist kind of tool, and maybe we were saying, oh, we just use it for people with type 1 diabetes and they're lucky if they can get it, because even then insurance isn't, quite accepting it yet. And that's not very many years ago. I fought a lot of battles shorter than 5 years ago for insurers to cover continuous glucose monitoring. Well, this is my opinion now. I think CGM should be used for glucose dysregulation, as I hinted at when I said I should change the title of this or the goal of this slide deck to understand glucose dysregulation by use of CGMs better. So diagnosing diabetes or pre-diabetes, it helps to reveal patterns. It also can reveal reactive hypoglycemia, which many people who have their foot in the door of type 2 diabetes are experiencing that. And even people yet to be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes will report some episodes of what could only be imagined as reactive hypoglycemia prior to their bona fide diagnosis. Gestational diabetes, CGMs are not labeled for use there, but certainly I am a personal believer in using continuous glucose monitoring in gestational diabetes. We don't test a lot of pregnant ladies for a lot of things, but we use a lot of things like insulin, right? And so I think that that's a really important time. And talk about seeing and believing when you use it in the case of gestational diabetes, and you can really convince the pregnant mommy what foods might be better at breakfast than others. Okay. Now, diagnosed diabetes with or without insulin can be very revealing. People can see direct correlations with what they eat and the medications they take, especially if it's a medication that does affect insulin output and or substantiates insulin production, as in using insulin itself. Also, with or without insulin, measurement of the effect of exercise is really spectacular. And you can convince somebody that, oh, my morning chores actually lower my glucose. That's amazing. Well, maybe I'll do 2 more chores outside, or maybe I'll mow my lawn more often than what I've done in the past, because look at the brownie points I get out of that. So it's so revealing. The other thing is, and I'm not sure this is a real term, but I like it, stage technology, or the preface to a pump. I've started working with a lot of older patients now after my, my 10 years with peds only. And now I'm working with some people on, my age of the spectrum here. And there are people who still are kind of leery of technology. But there are some people who are just amazing. So don't underestimate anybody. But introducing someone to glucose management technology by the use of a continuous monitor might be a nice stepping stone to a pump. Now, especially in Always, I believe that continuous glucose monitors ought to be used with pumps. all insulin use, and insulin use situations is how I've termed it, surgery. So CGMs are not really labeled for surgery, and there's fluid volume issues in some situations. But the other thing about CGM always to remember is that the number on the screen is not the most important data. It's the trend and the dots. Okay, so the exact number on the screen might be 20 points different than what the blood glucose is, but if that trend is showing you're falling, then you can conventionally check glucose. I think continuous glucose monitors are being widely used in surgery, and certainly I know that they're widely used as acceptable on certain pediatric hospital floors nowadays too, because people have become convinced. And the caveat is always, if you feel like your patient is exhibiting signs that don't line up with the continuous monitor, or they're saying, I don't feel like this is telling us, it's saying that I'm 55 and going down. I'm holding a fine conversation with you, so maybe we should do a finger stick before I, throw that 8 ounces of orange juice down, that kind of thing. So there is always the caveat: if your continuous monitor value does not align with how your patient feels, then do a finger stick and then kind of investigate why there might be differences. Okay, so here are some of those things you might see. So this is a little scenario, okay? These are 2 average days, and the one on the left, and you might notice that the green bar highlights the target range that has been selected. So it's 70 to 130, just so you know. So this is someone with pre-diabetes or diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but early on. Okay, so the green bar is there just for an IQ. I'm in the range where I want to be. All right, now on May 2nd, you see there's another average day, but the scenario is different. So this is where you can probe and ask questions. Boy, look at April 28th. That was pretty fantastic. I can kind of see where we ate and kind of see how quickly the trending up changed around and flattened back out. Now that day, remember, is compressed. That's 24 hours, which is why it does look spiky. So that's 24 hours that you're looking at on that daily graph. Okay, so if you look at hours at a time, it looks much flatter and smoother. All right, so come to May 2nd, and we go, oh, look, there's a little bit of a dip below 70. And then we get a little bit spikier through the afternoon after 3 p.m. And then, whoops, what happened at 9? So in the interrogation or the polite chat that you have with your patient, you say, what was different on that day? And come to find out that person fasted until 2 p.m. So there along about 9 a.m. when activity started, the liver responded to that fast and the glucose flattened out. It didn't continue to go low. Okay, so this again is pre-diabetes or early type 2, no medications. Okay, but that's a learning experience, isn't it? Didn't need to eat anything. It took care of itself. People learn that who have reactive hypoglycemia like that is many people, if you talk to them about that, you feel that funny kind of little bit dizzy feeling, you say to yourself, I'm really hungry. And maybe they're not purposefully fasting. Maybe they just got a long stretch between breakfast and lunch or something, and you go to the refrigerator and you feel like you want to just clean it out. Okay, so reactive hypoglycemia might have occurred. If you have a CGM on, you might see glucose levels in the 50s, high 50s. That is not uncommon and can be validated if you're really fast with a finger stick, because the liver is faster than you going and finding your old-fashioned meter and doing a finger stick and checking. By the time you check, you're probably back in the 70s, and a few minutes later you're going, oh, I feel okay now. That's weird. And then you remember, oh yeah, my liver can really store glucose. Then you see later on after that fast that we probably grazed through the afternoon and caved in later, and did some self-talk that maybe wasn't too helpful. I went, well, I skipped breakfast, so I deserve it now. So I'm going to help myself to cornflakes and milk. And even though the milk was a high protein milk, the cornflakes did their thing. And you can see that. But you can also see the sharp fall, that by midnight, or even 11 o'clock, it turned around pretty quickly. There wasn't a lot of time spent above 130, but it's a kind of a Pavlovian thing. And somebody might say, I'm probably not going to eat those cornflakes again. So then what you do is you teach, refined foods. We've taken the grain and smashed it to smithereens and pressed it into a cute little shape. And we also teach that maybe those calories aren't worth that. All right, now here's a fun one. And this is where am I headed? So I'm already 163 and straight up. This is kind of a convincer that, yes, you really do have pre-diabetes. And depending on where it goes from here, we might call it type 2 diabetes. Okay, not that you can diagnose with a CGM, but you can sure help illustrate to people, why is their A1C, which was once 5.7, why is it now finally popped to 6.1? Okay, does that kind of make sense there? So white rice is a good one for testing the waters. All right, here's another one. So this is the A1C for this person mostly. We had a breakfast of 2 eggs and 1 piece of white toast. So this is a little story. I don't know if you guys in the state of Idaho know that the DMV has changed the way they do things nowadays. And you go to the DMV and it's like Baskin and Robbins. You have to take a ticket or sign up for your time. And in your time, you might not know when your time to come back is. They tell you, go away and we'll call you and you can come back, but you have to be here in 20 minutes. Okay. And the people in line are telling you, yeah, they didn't call me for 3 hours. So if you had something else in your day planned and it didn't include food in the car, you might be inclined to stop at the novelty popcorn shop just 3 doors down from the DMV because you're starving. So on the run. And that novelty popcorn, it's pretty hard to stop at half a cup. So 5 to 6 cups of popcorn later, and then even more waiting at the DMV, you can see what happens there. All right. So I should have put a poll in here and asked you all guess what you think happens next. So here it is. So remember that reactive hypoglycemia I was telling you about? So when someone with pre-diabetes or early type 2 diabetes, if you eat something challenging and those beta cells are still able to function, they might kick out more than what you need. So this is a picture of reactive hypoglycemia, but it was enhanced by a stop because we had those maybe 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. And it's like, okay, I can't drive all the way home because that's too far. That's more than 20 minutes away. So what can I do in the meantime? I have to go get feed for my animals. So I'll go to D&B and I'll get 150 pounds worth of feed. I did run home and unload it in the barn like I was playing an extreme game. Throw the feed sacks, unload the feed, and I planted and watered some flowers. I grabbed some cheese and some pepperoni sticks and headed back to the DMV, where I, on the way driving, could feel this. And because I had a CGM on, I could scan and see it. And I went, oh, this is such a great story. This happens. This is real. And, if you get to talking to those people with pre-diabetes or early on type 2 diabetes, they'll tell you stories like this. They may not know, but they'll remember, oh, I had one of those moments and I just, and I was at D&B and they have those, popcorn things in the shape of a corn cob. And man, I scarfed one down and blah, blah, blah. So at any rate, with a CGM on, you can see it happen. And so then people learn, I don't want to do that. It doesn't feel good. I don't want to do it. And I can smooth out my glucose with some difference in planning and my habits. Okay, so on the drive home, like I said, here was where I flattened out at 65 per my CGM, but the slide before was 68 with a straight down arrow. So I might have hit in the 50s. And this is my ode to our counter-regulatory hormones. No food was eaten. And thank goodness I got done at the DMV 6 hours later and I was on the way home. All right, here's the next survey question. So Ashley, take it away. And you're muted, dear. So do you feel like CGM plays an important role in education and healthcare decisions in anyone with glucose dysregulation?
Claudia, did I skip one? Did I skip ahead?
I
Or is
don't
this the
think-
right survey?
Oh, yeah, you did skip ahead.
I'm sorry.
That's all
That's
right. We can answer this one too, and then
Okay.
go back to the first one. Yay, thank you, thank you. You all make me so happy. Okay, now let's go back to that first one. And let's see, I'll move this on my, so here's the question. What is the most important thing to consider when you recommend or choose a CGM? Insurance coverage or cost, whether it's integrated with pump or a pen, ease of use, will the person with diabetes use it, or all of the above?
And Claudia, I missed this in the polls. So if everyone could just put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat box, that will
All
help
right.
us record your response. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
perfect. And then we'll just skip ahead. And Ashley, when you get a feel for things, let's go there. You can
Will
interrupt me
do.
and tell me.
We got a lot of 4s coming in.
Okay. I agree completely.
Yep.
I think we can deal with number 1 and number 2. Number 3 is really critical. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Let's see. My slide doesn't want to move again, so I think you're in control. Moving, not yet. There we go. Okay. So here's the barriers, okay? So when you want to choose the right one or how we're going to get through these barriers might hinge on some of these conversations. So you might ask, did I skip? No. Okay. You might ask your patient, what are their thoughts about using? So find out what specifically their barrier is. Maybe it's nothing, but maybe they ask you, will my insurance cover? And that's sort of the last bullet point here. But start the conversation and maybe use this slide to kind of guide you. Are they afraid of what they might see? And that's a real barrier. I have met with lots of people who don't want to wear a CGM and will come right out and tell you, I don't want to know. I don't want to see it. I'm afraid of what I see it. It might make it real. Okay, that's a big one. Now, so how do I move from that kind of a barrier? Is I might coax someone into a trial. And as I mentioned earlier, there are samples available. Dexcom is now sampling, which is just marvelous. So a transmitter and one sensor. So you have to have a phone that's compatible because they're not sampling the reader. Okay, so and then Libre has samples, and that's a great way to get someone started, or the professional CGM as an option. The deal with a professional CGM is most of the time when someone's wearing a professional CGM, and Libre Pro is really the only one viable that's out there right now, is it's blinded. So they're not seeing it until after the fact. So now that Dexcom and Abbott are both sampling fairly liberally, I would say try and coax them into a sample and just say, don't get hung up on it. Just look at it. You know, if you're using insulin, make your decisions off your finger poke meter. We'll talk more about this next time, but just wear it for me for a few days and look at it. If people tumble to making changes on their own, then suddenly that's very empowering. If they decide, look, I didn't really need that bowl of cornflakes. They tasted awful anyway. Why did I do that? Or if they learn that if I share half an ice cream sandwich bar with my spouse, I didn't get the same effect. I didn't get the rise in glucose. It was flatter. Must be the fat in the milk, or the ice cream product, and so, they teach themselves, what are my thresholds? What are my tolerances? If you can just get them to wear it for a few days and see and do a few experiments. Now, the other big one that I see is that we've heard that CGMs are not accurate. They don't stay on, they fall off, they lose connection, blah, blah, blah. Well, educate on number one, why the two are different. And I hope today I've given you enough ammunition to have that conversation. Feel free to steal anything you want of my ideas. And why they're different, that we expect them to be different, especially during high rates of change. In other words, when your insulin's really working, whether it's endogenous or exogenous, expect things to be different, okay? Now, you can discuss how to wear it, where to stick it to keep it out of sight and out of mind. These devices are labeled to be stuck on the body in particular places. That's because that's where they were tested and FDA labeled as such. But you really can't stick them other stuff or stick them in other places. So, for example, I can't get my arm up here in the picture. Instead of back here, where I'm liable to catch my sensor on a door jamb, I've got enough real estate and ooshy gushy tissue that I can move it forward a little bit. Number one, I'm more cognizant of it because I see the darn thing. If I see the adhesive lifting up, I can put some extra tape on it. In Idaho right now, we're all dry as a bone. And so sensors have a pretty good capability of staying on unless someone is just very oily or really sweaty, and you might have to teach them how to lay down some stickum stuff underneath and put over bandage on the top. And Dexcom provides free over bandage, so does Medtronic. You can use all sorts of tegadermy type stuff with Libre. I've found that I rarely have to over tape. But we're all different skin-wise, okay? Now, the other thing is Bluetooth compatibility, where people will say to you, well, it never kept connection. Well, I'm a big gal. You guys can see that, okay? If I put my Libre up here and I'm using my phone and it's in my hip pocket, it's possible that I might not get it to Bluetooth, or I should say with truly Bluetooth and continuous like Dexcom, I might have a gap in data, or I might get an alarm that it's not connected, especially if I'm sleeping. So if I sleep on my sensor, wherever the device is, whatever device is trying to read it, that might cut out the data for a few minutes, okay? So sometimes certain phones, even though they're compatible, might have crappy Bluetooth too. And so your Bluetooth does make a difference in these devices. While I'm talking about that, mentioned sleeping on your sensor, that can lead people to seeing what are called compression lows. So if I put my entire body weight on my sensor over here, I'm going to blanch out the interstitial fluid tissue. And so I'm going to end up with a false low. And that freaks lots of people out. So you really do need to teach that. And a false low looks like we've just stepped off a 10-story building. You really go straight down. Okay, you're putting along nice because it's usually during sleep, and then boom, you're straight down. And if you take no insulin, there's no other reason for that. And if you took no insulin preceding that, there's no reason for it either. So you do a finger stick check maybe to help people understand that compression low can be true. Okay, so most offices now can have access to demo models of Dexcom and Libres so that they can, get them out and show them. Another great way to have people kind of look at the things before they even agree to a sample is maybe through a support group or an online Facebook group, which it seems like those are the support groups in this day and age, or at camp, kids. And as I mentioned, social media aspects, or just tell them to go to the website, go to the company website and poke around and look at it. Okay, what does insurance cover? Is there a copay? What can the person to afford? Get them to check it out. Send a prescription to get a quote. Okay, you have to send a prescription. It has to get to the pharmacy and or the DME. So Libre and Dexcom are both pharmacy benefits now for the majority of insurers. And so if you get a prescription in front of the pharmacist can run it and tell you whether there's a copay or a cost. Okay, both companies have great customer care lines that will help you figure out if there's too much of a cost, whether there's a way to get a break on that with a coupon of some kind. Okay, so it's worth asking your patient to sort of work on that. It's worth it to you to invite those company reps from all of the companies making CGMs to your offices to talk to them and get the latest update about how they can help you get a CGM for your patient. And last but not least, what are they willing to wear? Lots of people say, I don't want something on me. But if I probe that enough, it's because I don't want something on me because either I don't want to let people know that I'm wearing something or whatever, and or I don't want to see what it's going to show me. And those are the usual barriers related to that. You can hide a sensor. It doesn't have to be where the public sees it. You can tuck it away pretty easily. And so that one you can kind of refute, but that data or looking. And then, is a mobile app okay? I don't want to carry something extra. Well, until I tried it both ways, I probably would have said, yeah, I just want to use my phone to see my data. But when I carried a reader and just had that in my pocket, I felt like I could put my phone down and I didn't have to carry my phone anymore, So you might find that people changed given it a chance. And then as far as downloading, if you're not using a phone and using a reader, for example, with either system, Dexcom or Libre, and or you're for some reason needing to download through CareLink, you've got to have a computer at home to do that. Okay. And I always say customer care is the best one for helping you jump those hoops. I would rather not spend all of my diabetes education time with someone walking through all of that, but it is easy to load up the mobile apps. And then the final thing is compromise. Let them wear whatever they'll wear. If you think they should go this direction or that direction, but they want to go another direction, then let them go the other direction. And so, like I said, there's samples available, and that makes a really good opportunity. Tell them, okay, yeah, it's a 14-day sensor, but if you want to take it off in 3 days, it's okay. It'll pull off like a really bad Band-Aid. But, if it's just bugging you and you say, I can't handle this, okay, let's get 3 days worth, and so do a little motivational interviewing. Is there anything that makes you think you might wear it the full 10 or 14 days or whatever, or 7 days for the Guardian, and they say, no, I can't possibly. Well, what could you, what are you willing to do? Are you willing to do 3 to 5 days? Because that would really help us understand some patterns and maybe make some improvements. And you could wear it again in another month or 2 months. Okay, so find out what they're willing to do. So your role and success with this technology has to do with those questions we've just been discussing and how you interact with your patient. You have to be able to show the value of the device, I think, as related to real-time activity. And teach, though, that the data that you see is actionable. You can make decisions and do something different. And when people see that, they become motivated. As I mentioned, I train people on insulin pumps, and I met with 2 police officers a week ago, one who had retired and one who's just getting started. The one who had retired was pretty hardcore. He'd come from Los Angeles, and he had been diagnosed 11 years ago. And he's still pretty ticked off that he has diabetes and that it requires him to use insulin. He was very likable, but he came off ticked off and crusty and giving insulin after he ate most of the time. I went through some of these things that I've shared with you today in the beginning of the slide deck to explain how insulin works, how food works, how it converts to glucose, and how his new pump integrated with a CGM will work to smooth out his glucose. And I said, it's your decision, but I will tell you it will be much more effective and efficient if you try this. Well, I didn't know whether he was going to try it, but I called him 2 days later, and bless his heart, he tried it and he was now a believer. He said, I have seen a miracle happen. And he had his glucose, he hadn't seen anything above 175, and his average was 125, and he'd had no lows. Now he had the benefit of an integrated pump too. And so that was helping him, but the pump wasn't having to kick up and down a lot because he made that change. He made that behavior change because he could finally understand it. And when I said, I know because you're a career police officer that you understand discipline. And it's just a case of valuing the discipline to achieve a result. And so if we can teach that, or at least open the door where people see there's a result I desire and a means to get to it, perhaps they'll engage in some of the things that we can teach them. So I love reviewing the report downloads, as I mentioned, especially the ones that have the color bars in them that show how that green grows when they start making different decisions. And you see that improvement in the glucose overall, or just the average glucose. Your average glucose was 200, and the last 2 weeks it's now 158. That's huge. That's big. And that little, even stepwise, even a week later, if it was 175, that's big, unless we've increased our variability to get there. So you want to watch that glucose variability. So when glucose variability comes down along with average glucose, you've got a winner. And you can, show that in color and on paper and on screenshots. Encourage your patients to take screenshots like some of those silly ones that I've shared with you today, so that they can share their aha moments with you. The picture really is worth 1,000 words in CGM, and you can see that improvement in time and range. Time and range is highlighted here on these AGP reports so that you can understand more about it and you can explain more to your patient about what it means actually. Okay, so we're compressing all the variability you see here in the AGB to improve our time and range and lower our standard deviation or coefficient of variation. You'll hear that term too, or glucose variability, which is more simply put. All right, so why should we do this? Because we have clinical standards and guidelines that tell us this is the right way to go. So we want to have clinical targets for our continuous glucose monitoring, and we want to look at them and understand them. And here are some of the best resources that I have accessed. The International Consensus on Time and Range is a beautiful piece of work, and it has, of course, a huge bibliography of all of the best CGM studies that you can take a look at your leisure. Many of them are open access too. And so that's wonderful. If you are associated with a hospital or whatever, you might have a library that can access studies for you that you're interested in. If you reach out and connect, oops, I'm jumping ahead just a little too quick here. If you reach out to people like scientific liaisons, they can provide those clinical studies directly to you too. Your salespeople cannot. Please don't ask them for studies. Go to the scientific liaisons. All right, so look at this. I should have put another poll in after these pictures and said, so who has seen these? So who else is using CGM? So on my Facebook feed, of course, I get all sorts of things. I'll talk about the one on the right first, Super Sapiens. This is an Abbott product. It is labeled for mastering fueling with understanding continuous glucose levels. Abbott's history is with Team Type 1. Very famous cycling team, started out as just 8 members and now is thousands thousands, both type 1 and type 2, across the world. But early on, those athletes understood if I keep my glucose in a certain range, I perform better. So even people without diabetes appreciate that too. So what understanding your glucose fluctuations are doing, you can refuel as you perceive as needed. So this is called the Libre Sense on the right. It's a sports sensor. It's not labeled for use in glucose management for people with diabetes. But you can check it out at Super Sapiens. Just go to their website there. It's pretty impressive. If only I looked like some of those athletes. And then NutriSense, this one started popping up maybe 6 months ago. Okay. And this is also the Libre sensor, but it's called the NutriSense sensor. So I'm not sure what their business deal is with Abbott. But I did dig into this one a little more. So those slides that I've shown you with all the little stories and anecdotes, that's me. Okay. So in the height of COVID, so I want to say it was long about November or something, October, November, my A1C, which had consistently been 5.6, 5.7 for the last 25 years, jumped to 6.1. And I threw a sensor on because I wanted to see what was going on. Okay. At the next check, I was back to 5.6 because I could see what was going on. This company, NutriSense, is doing what I showed you in those slides and suggesting that people use this to help motivate their food making decision tree and stay in better shape. It's staffed by, at best I could count from their website, 17 to 20 registered dietitians. They have an advisory board and a clinical supervisor that is an MD with a specialty in obesity. And the issue here, though, is, of course, without the bona fide diagnosis, you don't have insurance coverage the majority of the time. But because it's a Libre, it's affordable. Now, they sell it as a package. And what I got out of a query that I followed with someone else asking, well, what is this and how much? 2 weeks was $175. So that sounds like one sensor and then some coaching that sounds like it's virtual and an app, of course, with feedback. $350 a month or $200 a month with a longer commitment. I've waffled around about how I feel about this. If you have people with a pre-diabetes diagnosis, I would encourage you to have their prescriber write a prescription and see if you can get it through Medicare. Mine is being covered through Medicare, and I have a pre-diabetes diagnosis. So I think we're positioned to do counseling as well as anybody. And, but I'm not saying this is a bad thing at all. I think it's fascinating, and just following them on Facebook, both of them is quite intriguing to watch, how people are using this additional information about glucose regulation in the body and how it, is our fuel and helps us to function most efficiently. The Super Sapiens, I couldn't see that there were any bona fide coaches, but they have video tutorials, all sorts of them about, fueling for particular styles of exercise and things like that. So pretty cool stuff, I think. All right.
Claudia,
last
we
poll.
had a question come in real quick.
Yes.
Quick question. What is the goal for target glucose variability?
So you're really striving to meet those clinical standards of 80 to 180. Okay. And if you can keep your variability certainly under 50, that's headed in the right direction. Let me just say that. If it kind of like all of our goals, we have standards depending on the age of the patient and other concomitant issues and illnesses. So the older we get, the softer we get, the younger we are, the softer we are. or the more we expect there to be variability. But certainly if you're under 50, you're headed the right direction. You know, I would like to say if everybody could be 30 and under, that would be fantastic. And I really don't think you can do that without continuous monitoring. I hope that answered the question. Any other
Right.
questions?
Yes, there was one more that came in. I want to make sure that it, what is the mechanism for the vitamin C interaction?
I don't know the mechanism. It affects, well, I don't know it as scientifically as I once did. It affects, there's a component of breakdown, if I'm remembering this right, of vitamin C that resembles glucose. So if you take vitamin C in substantial amounts, it may affect the sensor's ability to detect actual glucose. So that's a little bit of a conundrum there. But if you go to the labeling for Libre, it will spell out the quantity of vitamin C it's talking about, and it's a lot. So your average person taking a multivitamin, not an issue. But if you're, you know, eating the tube of Airborne, maybe an issue.
Okay. And for the poll, we had already answered the first one, the do you feel like
Yes.
CGM plays an important role? And everyone did. So the next one, I'm just going to pull up and we'll just give you
Okay.
like 10 seconds so that we make sure we stick with time.
Okay. So this question is, do you feel like cost is still a barrier? And, you know, I didn't give you the price points for maybe, you know, knowing what the difference is between Dexcom and Libre and Guardian and that. This question is more about, do you feel like you might be able to work around that as a barrier and figure out how to get some form of a CGM on a person? Okay, so 78% of you still feel like cost is the main barrier. So again, I would really encourage you to have prescribers write prescriptions, to investigate with the insurer what their coverage is and under what circumstance it is, and to also think that there is value in wearing a continuous monitor sporadically and using a sample at least once. And then the other thing I would add to this is let your patient be the decider when it comes to, is cost a barrier? If you look at cost value, you may find that there is a difference in the systems, significant enough that someone would be able to pay out of pocket. Okay, Ashley, we just have a couple of last slides to finish up with. And some reason right after we do that, there we go. All right, so let's talk in line of thinking about cost a little bit with what's coming up too. I don't like to sell futures, but these systems are just around the corner. It's my belief. So the Libre 3 will have the phone app. There will be no scanning needed. It will be the sensor itself will be the size of a penny, or specifically 70% reduction in size of the little round crisp that's on your body. The Dexcom G7 will be fully disposable. In other words, it will have the transmitter built into the sensor, much like the Libre already does. It will be a 10-day wear to start. I put that in quotes with the idea that they're, you know, probably pushing forward to a longer wear type, and we'll have precision dosing capability and integration. It's expected that Libre will have integration as well with pumps, especially the Tandem and Omnipod going forward too. There are business deals, you know, that have been in place for years. Part of the reason that hasn't happened is that vitamin C piece. So that's all being worked on. There's Medtronic's new sensor, which should have some improvements to the sensor It'll still be a 7-day where there'll be one calibration required a day, and it'll be approved down to 2 years of age. And then a new kid on the block, from Waveform. It'll be a nickel-sized sensor, which reads for 15 days with a rechargeable transmitter and a phone app. So good things to come. With these kinds of changes, you can expect more competitive pricing, I believe, amongst the systems. If we're going to have standalone CGM systems that replace fingerstick use, they kind of have to mirror the cost of fingerstick. Libre gets there pretty much with that. Dexcom is priced higher at this point in time, but with this next change, that may change. So don't give up on getting a sensor for someone who's interested in wearing one, whether you start with a sample and then investigate insurance coverage and benefits. And I'm here to tell you that insurance coverage is changing. And I think programs like the NutriSense that I just showed you, and people who are doing studies that show early behavior change in people with prediabetes and understanding of that, you'll find that hopefully our insurers will not stay with a penny wise, pound foolish approach to monitoring glucose, but will take a more proactive stance on covering glucose monitors. So don't give up. Go to the websites to find out when these things happen. Ask questions of the technical or clinical care people, your medical education partners, and the scientific liaisons. Each company has those. Look for them. You can access them through your the websites. They almost all have that. It is 1 p.m. and here is my last slide. Thanks for hanging out with us. And I hope you've had a good time and have some ideas and have had enough lunch. And here are some ways to find out more resources and also look forward to that new technology. You can always email me if you'd like with more questions or get in touch with Ashley. Thanks so much for dialing in today, y'all.
Thank you so much, Claudia. This was awesome. And there were a couple more questions that came in. And so if you guys want, I can send those over to Claudia and then reply back via email to get those questions answered for you. Just so you guys know, we plan on continuing these educational opportunities throughout the year. So please visit our website, diabetesallianceofidaho.org, to kind of keep up to date on that. Go ahead and fill out our membership form. That will get you our newsletters that are sent out monthly, and that'll be the quickest and most efficient way to get you all the information you didn't need to know about all the awesome resources that we will be providing. Following this presentation this afternoon or tomorrow, we will be sending out a survey that we ask you to please complete, especially if you're seeking continuing education credits. It is a requirement to attend the presentation and complete the end of presentation survey. So that will be coming into your inbox this week. So please complete those and send those over as soon as you can. With that being said, thank you guys so much for attending. We appreciate all the work that you guys do for continuing patient care and improving our quality improvement initiatives around the state. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and we will be in touch. So have a great rest of your day.